HOA President Victor Grayson thought he could torch Jake Sullivan's Harley and stroll away unscathed, cloaked in the armor of rules and authority. He figured the police would turn a blind eye, the neighbors would keep their mouths shut, but he overlooked one critical detail. Jake wasn't alone. With a single text, the word spread, and by sunrise, 500 bikers thundered into town, ready to prove that brotherhood outweighs bureaucracy. But stick around, because Victor's pristine little empire was about to implode in ways he never saw coming, leaving him a shadow of the man who once ruled the neighborhood. Jake Sullivan had lived in that house for 2 decades, and he'd long since realized that being under an HOA was like being shackled to a small-time dictator. Every year, the rules grew more absurd, the fees climbed higher, and the board got cockier. It started with petty nonsense. No flags, no decorations, not even a wind chime, because apparently, it might disturb the peace. Jake had rolled his eyes and let it slide. Just like he ignored the notice about his grass being a 1/4 inch too tall last summer, or the one griping about his trash cans peeking out from the side of the house. But this time, they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. That morning, he found an envelope slapped on his door like some cowardly ultimatum. HOA violation notice, $500 fine. The crime? Parking his Harley-Davidson in his own driveway. Jake let out a dry, bitter laugh. His garage was packed, tools, car parts, a workbench buried under half-finished projects. The Harley had sat outside for years, and no one had batted an eye. Now, out of the blue, it was a problem. This wasn't about regulations. This was personal. He knew exactly who was behind it. Victor Grayson, HOA president, neighborhood despot, and a guy who lived to make everyone else's life hell. Victor had had it out for him for years, probably since that meeting where Jake called him a washed-up rent-a-cop in a polo shirt. Yeah, that hadn't gone over well. Jake eyed the fine, then his bike, sleek, black, chrome gleaming like it was alive. This wasn't just a motorcycle. It was freedom, defiance, the open road. It was his dad's bike, the one they'd rebuilt together when Jake was 17. His old man used to say, "A man's gotta have something worth fighting for, Jake, something they can't rip away." This Harley was that something. Jake traced his fingers over the gas tank, feeling the cool metal under his rough hands. Screw it. He crumpled the letter and tossed it onto the workbench. Let Victor bluster all he wanted. The bike wasn't moving. That night, Jake jolted awake to a sound that hit him like a punch to the gut, a deep, earth-shaking boom. The air reeked, thick with burning oil and rubber. He stumbled out of bed and saw it through the window, a furious orange glow tearing through the darkness. No. Barefoot, shirtless, he sprinted outside, the cold pavement biting his feet. His Harley was engulfed in flames, fire clawing at the sky, melting chrome into liquid rivers, devouring the leather seat. It wasn't just burning, it was howling, metal twisting like it was alive, like it was suffering. The heat blasted his face, stinging his skin, but he didn't care. He lurched forward, instinct screaming at him to save it, but it was too late. The flames had already spread to the lawn, licking the edges of his driveway. Then, through the inferno, he saw him. Victor Grayson stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, arms crossed, a smug smirk curling his lips. Jake's stomach dropped. The bastard wasn't even hiding it. Bathed in the flickering light, Victor looked like he was savoring the chaos, like this was some sick joke. Jake's fists tightened until his knuckles popped. For a heartbeat, he saw himself charging across the street, grabbing Victor by his pristine HOA polo and slamming him into the asphalt. But something stopped him, maybe the realization that this wasn't the end, maybe the cold fury coiling in his chest, whispering to wait. This wasn't an accident. This was a declaration, and if Victor thought Jake would just swallow it like some spineless homeowner, he was in for a hell of a wake-up call. The fire department showed up with all the urgency of a Sunday stroll. By the time they bothered setting up their hoses, the flames had finished their work. All that remained was the charred husk of Jake's Harley. He stood there, barely feeling the lingering heat, barely hearing the hiss of water meeting smoldering metal. The air stank of melted rubber and scorched steel, laced with something deeper, something personal. He could still see it, the flames swallowing his dad's bike, the one they'd pieced together over late nights in the garage. It was road trips down Highway 1, the wind whipping past, his old man's voice shouting over the engine. Feel that, Jake? That's freedom. It was the last tether to the man who'd raised him, and now it was Ash. A firefighter clapped a hand on his shoulder. Sorry, man, the guy mumbled. Jake didn't respond. His throat felt like it was clogged with soot. The cops rolled in 10 minutes later, sauntering over like this was a minor annoyance. 2 officers, one older, one younger, both oozing apathy. The older one, a stocky guy with a gut straining his uniform, gave the scene a lazy once-over before sighing. Looks like an accidental fire, he said, already scribbling in his notepad. Jake blinked. Eh, what? His voice was sharp, barely restrained. The cop shrugged. Could have been electrical, maybe a fuel leak. Bikes go up fast with gas involved. Jake's jaw clenched so hard it hurt. That's bullshit. The cop sighed again, like he'd rather be anywhere else. Got any proof it was arson? Proof? Jake's gut twisted, rage boiling under his skin. He didn't need proof, he knew. And the proof was standing right there. Victor Grayson wasn't even pretending to care. He lingered on the sidewalk, arms still crossed, that smirk barely hidden. Not obvious enough for the cops to notice. But Jake saw it. The glint of triumph in Victor's narrow eyes. The way his polished loafers stayed spotless, too far from the fire to catch a speck of dirt. Too perfect. Jake had seen Victor look messier after a long HOA meeting. The bastard had done this. Such a shame, Sullivan, Victor said, shaking his head like he gave a damn. Real tragedy. His eyes flicked to the wreckage, then back to Jake, his mouth twitching like he was fighting a grin. But you know, HOA rules are rules. That thing shouldn't have been in the driveway anyway. Jake's blood turned to ice. The nerve of it, the smug little dance Victor was doing, it was infuriating. His fingers curled into fists, nails digging into his palms. You did this, he growled, voice low and lethal. Victor's smirk stretched just a hair wider. He leaned in, voice a whisper only Jake could hear. Prove it. Jake's breath came out slow and ragged, like a predator sizing up prey. Every muscle in his body screamed to lunge, to wipe that smirk off Victor's face with his fists. But that's what Victor wanted, a reaction, an excuse to slap him with a lawsuit or an assault charge. Jake forced himself to breathe, shoving the anger down deep, letting it simmer like the embers of his bike. The cops didn't care. They handed him a half-baked report that'd go nowhere. No investigation, no insurance payout, no nothing. Victor walked off, whistling like he'd just won another petty HOA squabble. Jake stood alone in the ruins of his past until he made a call. Jake Sullivan wasn't just some guy with a bike. The HOA, Victor, the indifferent cops, they didn't get it. To them, a Harley was a noisy nuisance, something to ticket and control. But to Jake, and men like him, it was more than that. It was freedom, the roar of the engine at 80 miles an hour, the road unrolling ahead like a lifeline. It was nights in dive bars, swapping tales with guys who carried the road in their scars and grease-stained hands. It was a brotherhood, not of blood, but of asphalt and steel. And now, that brotherhood was about to ride in. He sat on the edge of his bike's remains, the twisted frame still warm under his fingers, the stench of burnt rubber hanging heavy. The rage had cooled, not gone, just honed into something sharp and deadly. Jake pulled out his phone, thumb hovering for a moment before he typed. 7 words. They burned my Harley. Need backup. He hit send. For a few minutes, silence stretched over the cul-de-sac, broken only by a distant coyote howl. A porch light flickered on, some nosy neighbor, probably gawking at the troublemaker. Jake didn't care. He stared at his screen, watching the message sit in the group chat like a loaded gun. Then it started. On my way. Hold tight. Then, Texas crew riding out. 8 hours. Then, Nevada's rolling. See you at dawn. It became a deluge. Replies from California, Arizona, Texas, even Colorado. Some owed Jake favors. Others didn't need a reason. That's how it worked. You don't leave a brother hanging. By the last message, something shifted in Jake's chest. The loss still weighed on him, bitter and raw. But now there was something else. Justice, maybe. He didn't bother going inside. Instead, he grabbed a lawn chair, cracked a beer, and waited in the night air. When the sun broke the horizon, he heard them. The first rumble hit like a storm brewing, shaking the quiet suburban streets. Then another, and another, until it wasn't just a few engines. It was dozens, a tidal wave of sound tearing through Victor's perfect little world. Then they appeared, hundreds of bikers, leather-clad, tattooed, eyes shadowed behind sunglasses. Men with miles etched into their faces, men who'd fought and bled for their own kind of right. Jake stood, a slow grin spreading as the first rider pulled up and yanked off his helmet, revealing a face weathered by dust and time. "Damn shame about the Harley," the guy said, swinging off his bike. Jake nodded. "Yeah, but I figure we can fix that." The man's grin widened. "Oh, I've got some ideas." Behind him, 500 engines snarled in unison. At first, it was just a trickle, bikes rolling in, engines growling low, a handful of riders pulling up in pairs. They parked along the curb, boots hitting pavement, nodding silently to each other. Then, as morning wore on, the trickle became a flood, dozens, then hundreds, until the street vanished under a sea of chrome and leather. 500 strong, they filled the cul-de-sac and spilled onto every manicured lawn. The roar of idling Harleys shook hedges, rattled security cameras, and thumped against pavement as riders dismounted, some leaning against their bikes, others stepping onto the HOA's sacred grass like they owned it. And they did. Neighbors gaped through curtains, jaws dropped, phones trembling in their hands, torn between calling the cops and hiding. Some stood frozen on porches, clutching coffee like it could save them. The HOA board was unraveling. Mrs. Hensley, the treasurer, pressed herself against her door, pale as death. Mr. Baxter, the VP, stood on his driveway, mouth flapping silently as a biker lit a cigarette on his porch. But the real show was Victor Grayson. The untouchable HOA king stood rooted to the sidewalk, coffee cup crushed in his grip, knuckles white, sweat soaking his polo. For once, he wasn't smirking. For the first time in years, Victor looked terrified. His eyes flicked across the sea of leather jackets, tattooed arms, and black vests, an army that had taken over his pristine suburb. His voice cracked as he forced out, "What the hell is this?" Jake stepped forward, calm, too calm. "This," he said, gesturing to the bikers behind him, "is a homeowners meeting." Victor's eye twitched. "Oh, what?" Jake cut him off. "Since you're so big on community involvement, I thought you'd like some new voices." The men chuckled, a low rumble that made Victor flinch like he'd stumbled into a wolf den. "I'll call the police," he sputtered, voice thin. "This is trespassing, intimidation." Jake tilted his head. "You could, but I think they're tied up right now." Victor blinked, then heard it. A laugh, not from Jake, but from the crowd. Some bikers were leaning against squad cars at the street's end, chatting with cops like old buddies. Because some were veterans, business owners, even off-duty officers. Victor's face drained of color. His HOA empire, his control, was slipping away, and he was powerless to stop it. The HOA board panicked, fumbling for phones, dialing 911 like their lives depended on it. "This is an emergency," Mrs. Hensley shrieked, wild-eyed. "There are bikers everywhere." "Mr. Baxter begged, "Send everyone. They're taking over." Victor stood frozen, jaw working but silent, as his perfect world drowned in leather and chrome. Sirens wailed, but when the cops arrived, there was no riot, no crime, just bikers everywhere, some shaking hands with officers like it was a reunion. Jake watched Victor's face twist from fury to confusion to fear. "Afternoon, officer," Jake said as a patrolman approached. "Nice day, huh?" The cop nodded. "Heard about your bike." "Damn shame." Jake shrugged. "Yeah, real damn shame." Victor snapped. "They're trespassing," he spat, face red, fingers shaking at the bikers. "This is a hostile takeover." The cop took a slow look around, then shrugged. A biker pushed off a squad car. "We're residents too, pal," he drawled. "Just admiring the HOA's fine work." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Victor's control shattered. He wasn't the king anymore. Jake had turned the game on its head. Some bikers had filmed it all. The burned Harley, the cops doing nothing, Victor's panic. By afternoon, it was online, TikTok, Reddit, Facebook, then everywhere. #HOA fire scandal trended. Locals vented years of HOA gripes. Bikers piled on. Then the internet exploded. Someone found old complaints, Another dug up a doorbell cam of Victor with a gas can the night before. That was the dagger. By evening, news outlets ran with it. HOA president accused of arson, bikers fight suburban tyranny. Victor's empire collapsed. At the emergency HOA meeting, the board ditched him fast. Sweaty and small, Victor stammered. It's a misunderstanding, but no one cared. He was voted out, gone by dawn, a ghost of his former self. The HOA never recovered, its rules faded, its power broken. Jake's brothers rallied, raising cash and parts for a new Harley. One night, by a bonfire, they unveiled it. Black, chrome, flames etched on the tank. Jake smiled. Justice wasn't in a courtroom, it was on two wheels. Weeks later, he led 500 riders through the neighborhood, engines roaring, a final reckoning for a broken system, and a warning to anyone who'd dare try again.